On the one hand, there are those that say that Christianity is responsible for the persecution of witches, and previous civilizations simply didn't do such things. On the other hand, there are those who say that Christianity is right to prosecute witches, and that they are remarkably intelligent for doing so. Needless to say, both of these groups are completely wrong about this. Hi, my name is Joseph Cadotte, and this is Ill-Informed Opinion. And today we're going to be talking about witches, because it's October, the most glorious time of the year. So what's the truth? Well, the truth is we can go back as far as we want, in pretty much any civilization that we want. We can see persecution of witches pretty much everywhere. In fact, the only civilizations that reliably did not persecute witches were the Catholic civilizations of Europe and Asia and North Africa during the age that ranged from roughly around 700 AD to around the Protestant Reformation, during which point persecuting witches was not only discouraged but outright banned in 900 or so. The reason of this was pretty good. The church didn't believe that witches actually did anything. In fact, they hadn't since around the 300s, when the Council of Nicaea founded the Catholic Church. And there was a few times that this was changed, most noticeably around the time of Pope Innocent VIII, when a man named Kramer, who was a Dominican monk, decided to write the book that is most infamous in hunting witches, the Malleus Maleficarum, which endorsed hunting witches. Kramer wrote to the Pope and asked for sanction to hunt the witches. The Pope wrote back and said, sure, why not? Thus overturning roughly 1,100 years of policy. And Kramer wasn't satisfied, nor were any of the nobles who had asked him to hunt witches in Germany, which is where he was. So, what happened to this edict? Well, it was overturned pretty quickly. The book Kramer wrote, the Malleus, was not only removed from being endorsed, but was put on the index of banned books by the Catholic Church because of its content. And they went back to not going after witches. This spurred some Protestant groups, most noticeably Martin Luther and his cronies, to complain to the church that they needed to start going after witches and also Jews, because why not kill off another group of people who weren't doing anything wrong? That was one of the seeds of the Protestant Reformation, and you'll find that Christianity in the Protestant territories and some Catholic territories, which were more ethnically tied to the Protestant groups, very much the Germanic ones, went after witches with a fervor. Not as much as their Protestant counterparts, but still pretty darn active about it. So, 100,000, maybe more, witches were burned and killed in Europe. A few dozen, which is not a small number at the time, were hung or oppressed to death in the Americas. And this is where we get the idea that Christians hate witches. Not exactly true. In fact, one of the largest social experiments ever was conducted by the Catholic Church. It lasted 150 years. They sent out priests and monks and nuns to surveil covens, and found that witches primarily just got naked, ate a lot of shrooms and ergot and any other drugs they could find, lit a fire, and hallucinated a whole bunch of stuff, which the various clergymen and women wrote down and sent back. Nothing harmful was ever really done. As someone who's been sober at way too many parties, I can tell you I really feel for those monks, because sitting there with a bunch of tripping hippies is not fun. In any case, That's where the Catholic Church came down on it and comes down on it to this day. This is where a lot of people come down on it now. Because, after all, if someone wants to go dance naked in the woods around a fire, coincidentally, I'm in a park where apparently there was a fire here, which I wasn't aware of, and that's kind of why I chose this spot. That's fine, as long as they controlled the burn, and that's where we stand today. But then we get this claim that Christians are the only people who persecuted witches. Well, that's simply not true. In fact, as far back as you want to go in human history, witches and their like, male and female, have been persecuted extensively. Hammurabi's Code, one of the first legal systems ever written, and the basis for a lot of legal systems in the Middle East, Central and Western Asia, North Africa, and Europe, explicitly called for the death of witches. So did the 12 Tables, which is the Roman legal code. So did the Jewish code, which is laid out in the Torah. In fact, you can look pretty much anywhere and see just the same thing. There's a lot of reasons for this, but it comes down to two primary ones. Let's go with the more minor one first. The more minor one was that witches, which we would actually probably call apothecaries now, or pharmacists, although they didn't have a doctorate, obviously, provided a lot of treatments, herbalist treatments, which may or may not have actually done what they were supposed to do. Just like modern supplements, you can't always trust what's on the label because there's no regulation. This is where witches got the label poisoner, in part because they made abortificants and birth control, which is one of the most valuable parts of their contribution to society, and why Romans, while executing them in the second they crossed the city boundaries, tolerated them as long as they stayed outside the city so people could go get their birth control. So, the one thing they were reliable at making was poison and things like this. Again, similar to abortificants as well. Everything else was crapshoot. Basically, they were unregulated doctors. In a lot of cases, they saved lives. In a lot of other cases, they killed people. This was problematic because if you can't trust it, you don't know what's going to happen, then naturally you're going to blame the person who doesn't have the backing of the state or any other group. Hence, witchcraft persecutions. As important as that is, it's still a minor part relative to the big issue, which is that witches circumvented the power of the state. Here's the issue. For the longest time, the state and the local religions were bound together. In fact, in a lot of languages to this day, religion and law are intricately linked in terms of the words used. There's no deviation between them because the rules of the state and the rules of the religion were one and the same. This isn't just, for example, in states where priests were elected, such as ancient Rome, and a few other states around the Mediterranean in the classical era, but where the priests were the rulers. In the case of the Druids in the Celtic area, or any number of, well, we can just look at Iran, for example, for a modern day alternative. The Tibetan tyranny under the Buddhists, which is still better than the communist tyranny under the Chinese, is another example of states where the religion and the law were the same thing. So, witches basically undermined the power of the state because they operated outside the sanction of the local religion and outside the sanction of the local state. They're free, independent operators. If you wanted to get that fertility potion, you should be going to the priestess of Inanna. You shouldn't be going to your local witch. Priestess of Inanna will probably charge you a lamb, or if you're rich enough, a white calf or something like this, which means they get to eat it or sell it and have the proceeds. If the witch is charging only a chicken, which probably wasn't the case because no one ate chicken back then except by accident or in dire circumstances, but if the witch is charging only a chicken, you're going to go to the witch and not sacrifice, something that can give you milk. Witches were out competing a lot of the local clergy/rulers. This is problematic for obvious reasons. And this remains problematic for obvious reasons for a long time following. And so you'll see from Polynesia through to the Americas, wherever you have a state that's intricately tied to its local religion, and this was true in a lot of the Protestant states in Europe, you're going to see the persecution of witches. Because, hey, this is a competitor. If you want a love potion, go talk to Aphrodite via your local handy priests of Aphrodite. And they will accept your donation, smile, and do exactly as much for you as your local witch would for a lot less. So, and now something strange happens, though, when we get to around the 1800s and people start reconfiguring this idea of witches as magic workers. The fact that magic doesn't exist is actually essential to the idea that the Catholics came up with as to why you shouldn't go after witches, because they're not doing anything either positive or negative. Although, as apothecaries they were, but not as, they weren't casting spells and so on. I know many of my neo-pagan friends would disagree with that. That's fine. That's the perspective of the Catholic Church at the time, and to this day. But the idea that witches were fundamentally harmless starts cropping up as people become more and more interested in pre-Roman history. And you start getting affinity for the religions that were abandoned as Christianity, Islam, and others took over from the previous belief systems sponsored by the local governments. In fact, the Romans realized this and they switched over to the worship of the sun, Sol Invictus, for a while after they made up that cult explicitly to draw attention away from Mithraism, which was an early competitor for Christianity, and Christianity itself. So, anyways, more affinity became prevalent when people started looking at the old religions. And so you develop neo-paganism, which really kicks off with the invention of Wicca, which has no relation to ancient witchcraft rituals except what they can dig up. It's very much a recreation. And anybody who studied the history of Wicca will learn the same thing. Gardner did what he could to create a modern successor, but there really is no through line connecting modern Wicca to ancient witchcraft, which is actually pretty good, because ancient witchcraft, contrary to what a lot of people said, both for and against it, really was a collection of individual beliefs that had no relation to each other outside any given ethnic group or even region. So a witch practicing in Bulgaria would have no ties to the witches practicing in Japan, for obvious reasons. They wouldn't even have ties to people over in Romania, probably. There may be some similarities, but probably not as many as you'd think. So you're taking a piecemeal bunch of beliefs and you're trying to synthesize them into a belief system. And I think Gardner and his fellows did a pretty good job of that. And I look forward to Wicca growing to be a full-fledged religion someday, hopefully in my lifetime, especially if they can sort out the whole conflict over doctrines that plagues every young belief system. But we have to be clear that as much as I respect Wicca, it's distinct, and it is modern. And people who are Wiccan are rightly upset over what happened to their predecessors. But didn't just happen in Europe, it happened globally. And they should be upset about what happened to their predecessors globally. But they should be aware that these predecessors are more spiritual influences, the way, say, Sumerian mythology or Gnosticism are spiritual influences on Christianity as it's practiced today, rather than actually being an immediate direct antecedent. So I hope you found that interesting. And that's a little bit about witch hunts. Again, every practice of witchcraft historically was distinct. In a lot of the ways neo-pagans practice witchcraft now is distinct. Still will never get neo-pagan druids, because after all, is it really druidism unless you're sacrificing some dissident to a peat bog? Really? So, anyways, this has been Joseph Cadotte, and ill-informed opinions. You can find me online. Feel free to send me as many complaints, criticisms, and questions as you like, as well as suggestions for future videos.